If you're white, you're right. If you're black, step back.
So goes a familiar expression among Negro Americans. Its truth is dramatized daily in the restrictions placed on the Negro by the Jim Crow system of segregation, a subtle system in the North, a blatant system in the South. The stark signs of Jim Crow tell the story. Whites only. We wash for white people only. In various forms and disguises, segregation has been with us ever since slavery was abolished. The very name Jim Crow is made up of two derogatory slang terms commonly used for the Negro. And Negro Americans have voiced their protest against its indignities from its inception. Consider the case of Mrs. Catherine Brown. One brisk winter day, Mrs. Brown, a charwoman in the chambers of the United States Senate, set out from Washington, D.C. to cross the Potomac River and visit Alexandria, Virginia. Little did she realize that her 25-cent round-trip rail ticket entitled her to fire an opening shot in the long struggle against Jim Crow. For this was 1868. Mrs. Brown was a Negro, and her trip was to prove historic. Her ride over to Virginia was quiet and pleasant, but her attempt to return the same day was neither quiet nor pleasant. No segregation was practiced by the railroad on its trains leaving Washington, but trains leaving Alexandria had a special car for all passengers of color. Catherine Brown, however, did not take her seat in the Jim Crow car. Instead, she made herself comfortable in the car reserved for whites. A depot attendant soon spotted her and informed her of the Jim Crow car. But Mrs. Brown refused to leave, whereupon, to quote the later legal description,
the man attempted to put her out by great force and violence, with insult and indignities. She was compelled to employ a physician and remain under treatment.
On the advice of a Senate committee, which held a hearing in her shanty home, Mrs. Brown sued the railroad for $20,000 in a local court. The jury decided in her favor and awarded her $1,500. At this point, the railroad defendants took their case on appeal to the United States Supreme Court. The 1873 arguments before the High Court have a mid-20th century ring, even though the 14th and 15th constitutional amendments were not involved. The case revolved in large part around the meaning of the congressional charters to the railroad, which asserted that, quote, no person should be excluded from the cars on account of color, unquote. Now, the railroad lawyers contended that this provision was met by the separate Jim Crow car that assured that no Negroes would be excluded from the entire train. Mrs. Brown's lawyers disagreed, however. They maintained that the charter provision meant no racial discrimination and that separate facilities were in themselves discriminatory. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Mrs. Brown, upholding the lower court action. And on the matter of separate cars, the court opinion portended the future by reaching the same conclusion the Warren Court reached in the school desegregation cases in 1954, namely that separate racial facilities can never be equal by the very fact of being separate. In 1955, 87 years after Mrs. Brown had refused to yield her seat, the scene was repeated in Montgomery, Alabama. Mrs. Rosa Parks, a middle-aged Negro seamstress, started home one evening, weary from her day's work at a department store. After boarding the city bus and walking past the reserved white section in the front, she slumped into the first seat of the Jim Crow section in the rear of the bus. Soon the bus filled with passengers, and the driver ordered her and 3 other Negroes to give up their seats for white men who had just boarded. The other Negroes complied with the order, but Mrs. Parks, just as Mrs. Brown before her, quietly refused. She was arrested at once. Just 4 days after the arrest, Mrs. Parks was tried for disobeying the city's segregation ordinance. She was, of course, found guilty and fined $10 plus $4 court costs. Her case made an excellent test of the legality of segregation and was immediately appealed. 6 months after the arrest, Alabama federal judges ruled that the city bus segregation statutes were in violation of the 14th Amendment of our national Constitution. And later, the Supreme Court itself upheld this lower court ruling. Now, there had been many previous arrests following similar bus incidents throughout the whole South, but this was the arrest that ignited the Negro community. Mrs. Parks was highly respected among the city's Negroes, a soft-spoken, much-admired woman. Her arrest shocked Negro leaders. In a matter of hours, the idea of a boycott against the buses had been formulated and agreed upon. Within 24 hours, mimeograph leaflets telling of the arrest and calling for a boycott had been widely distributed. The boycott began in earnest during the trial and picked up momentum until virtually no Negroes were riding in Montgomery's buses. A new leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, became the chief symbol of this protest.
This, to my mind, is one of the greatest demonstrations of the fact that Negroes are not satisfied with second-class citizenship, with segregation, and with the lack of voting rights. So that this should convince the senators and representatives that Negro citizens of the United States are determined to be free.
The rest of America, indeed the world, watched fascinated as these developments unfolded. The nonviolent bus boycott idea spread quickly to other American cities, and even to South Africa. The Montgomery movement, triggered by the quiet seamstress, had become a major turning point in American race relations. Even more important than the legal victory achieved in Montgomery was this impetus and form the boycott gave to the Negroes' protest in America. The technique of nonviolent protest was added to the legal and political weapons that had long comprised the Negro arsenal. Soon the technique would be fashioned by Negro youth into the sit-in and Freedom Ride demonstrations against Jim Crow. Catherine Brown and Rosa Parks both acted, you see, in times of great social change and racial progress. Yet neither of the incidents was premeditated or planned. Though each of the actions set off a train of historic events, both were brought about by a simple demand for the American dream of equality to apply in direct and concrete ways. Both women had passively complied with racial discrimination throughout their whole lives. But on these occasions, they were exhausted, returning home after a long day. And each of them, in Mrs. Parks' words, was fed up with Jim Crow. Right now, the actions of Negro Americans as determined and as fed up as Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Parks are steadily inscribing the epitaph for Jim Crow. Indeed, race relations have become the most publicized and important domestic problem facing our nation today. But no national concern is so clouded by emotion and misinformation as race relations. A rational understanding of the problem's complexity by thoughtful Americans is sorely needed. Most of us, however, have either tried to ignore the problem or have relied on dangerously oversimplified explanations. For example, listen to these two gentlemen.
Well, George, here it is again in the paper. More trouble with the whites and the Negroes down south.
What's surprising about that?
Well, I just don't understand. I mean, why don't they leave well enough alone? Why do we have these men like Martin Luther King and this NAACP stirring up trouble? It gives America a bad look overseas.
I think the Negroes have a real gripe. They've had it rough ever since they were slaves. The whole problem is slavery. If we'd never had slavery, there wouldn't be any trouble today.
The first gentleman simply denies the problem and resents the activities of those who force him to recognize that everything is not perfect in race relations. If he had brown skin, I'm afraid, like Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Parks, he would find it difficult to ignore the second-class citizenship granted dark Americans. The second gentleman we've just seen faces the problem and makes an important historical point. Slavery, particularly in its unique American form, did plant the roots of present-day discrimination against Negroes. In a real sense, the two Negro ladies were forced to surrender their seats because the slave status, so long associated with brown skin, still had force in 1868 and even in 1955. This and other historical considerations are important first approximations to understanding American race relations. In bold and sweeping strokes, history outlines the scope and direction of the process. But our friend errs in grossly oversimplifying the problem. Many other parts of the world, Brazil, for instance, had slavery even longer than the United States, and today have race relations patterns very different from ours. Nor can he explain why, with almost everything else changing at an unprecedented rate, has there been so little change in race relations over the past century that two such similar seating incidents could happen 87 years apart. Obviously, no one factor such as slavery can do justice to the complexity of race relations. Yet how often do we continue to hear such simple theories and simple solutions? Witness these three discussions.
But Harry, this whole business of race, it pivots on the point that the South is a poor agricultural area. When more industry comes into the area, why, desegregation will come right in on its heels.
Oh, I don't think industry has anything to do with it. That doesn't make people like other people anymore. I think the whole problem is that these people don't have enough contact with one another. If we could only get the Negroes and the whites together more, like Brotherhood Week dinners.
Oh, you can blame it on anything you want, but I know these Southerners. They're just a bunch of stubborn bigots who naturally hate the Negro. Take it from me, nothing is going to change their minds.
Ralph McGill, the noted publisher and columnist of the Atlanta Constitution, once remarked that racial desegregation was introduced into the South by the boll weevil. This incisive insight refers to the vast social changes that have been occurring in the South during the past few decades, with the boll weevil acting as a vital impetus to the South to release itself from the clutches of King Cotton. This way of looking at racial change as part of the broader social changes going on in the society can be called the social-cultural approach, a perspective that updates and narrows our historical analysis. The first gentleman we've just seen, who stresses the importance of industry, is viewing the process from this social-cultural perspective. And, as far as it goes, he is perfectly correct. Note that the desegregation of schools and lunch counters tends to occur first in the big modern cities of Atlanta, Nashville, Memphis, Houston, Dallas. Indeed, Jim Crow is frequently the last vestige of the 19th century left in these rapidly growing industrial centers. And it is so out of joint with the times in these cities that it should be obvious that segregation in all its forms is foredoomed too. But once again, we see that this one factor, accurate as it is within limits, does not offer a complete explanation. Take Birmingham, Alabama, by way of illustration. Birmingham is the Pittsburgh of the South, a big, sprawling steel center that meets our friends' oversimplified requirement for desegregation. And yet this city has been the scene of repeated racial violence in the last decade, and it is one of the areas most defiantly resistant to racial change in the whole South. Nor can our friend explain why many white Southerners approved of Mrs. Parks' arrest, and many others living in the same communities were deeply ashamed. We're dealing, you see, with a most complex phenomenon. Now, the concerned lady we just heard from adds another dimension, that of contact between races in various situations. Now, this situational dimension cannot be overlooked. For as Harry Golden of Only in America fame has pointed out, the particular situation can completely restructure race relations. He notes that as long as everybody is standing up, segregationists seem not to object to mixing freely with Negroes. Trouble usually begins when the races sit down. So Golden suggested his now famous vertical plan for desegregation. That is, take out the seats from schools and lunch counters and then desegregate. In time, you can slowly revert back to seats by first having the students and customers reclining at 10 degrees and then 20 degrees and so forth. For these things, remarks Golden with a glint in his eye, must be done very gradually. The unfortunate difficulty with the lady's proposed solution for the problem, simply more interracial contact, is that it makes an erroneous assumption. More contact per se between groups does not necessarily make for better relations. Negroes and whites have had more contact in the South, for instance, than anywhere else in the nation. And yet my native region is not conspicuously famous for its interracial tolerance. The crucial thing is, what kind of contact? Now, the lady is not alone in her naive assumption. Many well-meaning people who sincerely want to help in the writing of Jim Crow's Epitaph have made the same assumption and have consequently, in my opinion, wasted much of their effort. Brotherhood Week instead of Brotherhood Year is one expression of these honest efforts. But such an endeavor largely fails because it does not directly confront Americans, as Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Parks confronted us, with a concrete problem that we must solve. Indeed, brotherhood dinners at $50 or $100 a plate held each year run the risk of allowing influential Americans to relieve annually their guilt over the treatment of their fellow Americans for a modest tax-deductible sum without actually doing anything. Now, that same guilt, directed in a more useful channel, is urgently needed. Our third discussant voices an often heard northern appraisal of the Southern scene. The South is full of bigots. He introduces a fourth perspective needed for understanding American race relations, the personality approach, the approach which considers the individuals in the process. Now, I hope you'll excuse me as a native Southerner myself if I take exception to his oversimplified use of this perspective. There are many reasons why a white Southerner discriminates against Negroes. One of the important reasons, to be sure, as the gentleman has already indicated, is pure, unadulterated prejudice and bigotry. But important, too, is the motivation to get along with his neighbors, to follow in the path of least resistance. In a word, to conform to the stern dictates of Southern culture. When your parents discriminate against Negroes, when your peers discriminate against Negroes, when your teachers at school discriminate against Negroes, when refusing to discriminate against Negroes means certain social ostracism, you do not have to be a bigot to discriminate against Negroes yourself. So powerful are the South's pressures to conform, one prominent Southern scholar, C. Van Woodward, has observed that white Southern segregationists are not nearly as afraid of communists and the Supreme Court and Yankees and Negroes, their four favorite targets, as they are afraid of each other. We should ask, too, just what our northern friend, who is so impressed with Southern bigotry, is doing to aid race relations himself. Is he one of the many white Northerners who believes in desegregation for the South, but who refuses to have Negroes buy homes in his neighborhood? If he is, then he fits perfectly the favorite, even if strange, defense of the Southern segregationists, namely, that the North is as guilty of mistreating the South, the Negro rather, as the South. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not defending the South by pointing out Northern bigotry. Rather, I'm trying to show that the two regions, ever since Catherine Brown's fateful ride in 1868, have been excusing their own forms of Jim Crow by emphasizing the sins of the other region. Both the North and South could make a strong case, of course, but two wrongs hardly make a right. Let's eavesdrop once more on a typical discussion of American race relations.
But it's different here in the North. We can't understand how the average white Southerner feels about the race problem. They might have a point. Look, if we lived down there, we'd probably look at things the way they do. We'd probably think differently about the integration of schools and restaurants and buses.
Yeah, and right. And if you ask me, the Negro ought to improve himself before he demands acceptance of the white people.
Two more perspectives from which to view race relations have been added by these people. The first person is particularly concerned with how white Southerners themselves perceive race relations, and thus contributes yet another perspective from which the problem must be viewed. Unlike the previous four approaches, his perceptual approach attempts to study the problem through the eyes of the people in the situation, for obviously how they look at the process and not how we look at it directs their behavior. How, for example, did the Montgomery bus driver interpret his calling of the police to arrest Mrs. Parks? Now, to guess what he thought on the basis of what the most vocal Southern sources say, the politicians, the segregationist newspaper editors, and the organized resistance groups, is most dangerous. Instead, we must turn to public opinion poll studies to cut through the racist din set up by these loud and conspicuous interpreters of the Southern scene. Now, when we do, we find that Gallup polls show 4 out of 5 white Southerners do in fact favor racial separation of public facilities. But they also show that 2 out of 3 of these same people realize that racial desegregation is inevitable. Furthermore, research in Charlottesville, Virginia indicates that white attitudes slowly but steadily become more favorable towards school desegregation after school desegregation has been in operation for a while. Now, you'd hardly expect it from listening to the professional racists. Most white Southerners, you see, actually expect and accept desegregation, even if they do not welcome it. In other words, the handwriting on the wall is now so clear that even illiterates can easily read it. The sixth and final perspective we need to evaluate properly American race relations is introduced by the second gentleman we've just heard from. By contending that Negroes need to improve themselves before demanding acceptance by whites, he raises questions about the object of the whole desegregation process, the Negro American himself. Now, this last approach, then, we might call the stimulus object approach. There are many important issues to be raised from this perspective, but our discussant is laboring under 2 popular and damaging misconceptions. First, he apparently believes that Negroes should advance under handicaps never faced by white Americans. That is, that the Negro must prosper under Jim Crow denials of adequate education, employment, housing, and so forth, before desegregation should occur. If he's genuinely interested in the advancement of Negro Americans, it would be more logical, wouldn't it, for him to work for the ending, not the perpetuation, of segregation. He also seems to feel that the goal of current Negro protest is to be accepted by whites. Now, apart from the racial conceit and the arrogance that's implicit in this assumption, our friend is ignoring the essential simplicity of the Negro American's aims, namely, to be allowed to be more, not less, of an American, to be a first-class citizen with full rights and personal dignity. Recall the simple demands of Catherine Brown and Rosa Parks. They did not ask for white acceptance as such, but merely for a seat on a public conveyance. Indeed, you remember Mrs. Parks was already in the Negro section and wearily wanted only to retain her seat at the end of a long day. Thus we see the epitaph for Jim Crow is now being written in many different ways. If we're to understand this exciting process, we must not limit ourselves to a single, narrow perspective or to a casual global statement that does not do justice to the problem's complexity. We must trace its historical roots, see its development in our social and cultural institutions, allow for the influence of the particular situation, and think of the personal qualities and special points of view that the individuals in the process possess. Most important of all, perhaps, we need to remember the effects of segregation on Negroes and the quiet courage of such Americans as Catherine Brown and Rosa Parks.
Cast in order of appearance: Russell Morash, Russell Hayden, Freeland Morris, Donna Fraser, Sherman Kingsbury, Neil Powell, and Hal Pike. Epitaph for Jim Crow is a presentation of the Commission on Extension Courses, 75 Mount Auburn Street, Cambridge 38, Massachusetts, in association with the Lowell Institute Cooperative Broadcasting Council, WGBH-TV, Boston.
This is NET, National Educational Television.